From the hidden secrets of our backyards to the realities of the third world, we take a raw and real look into the challenges and the pursuits of social justice. Welcome to The Point.
The Point podcast is brought to you by thepoint.life, offering healthcare, entrepreneurship, and education both domestically and internationally. Visit thepoint.life to find out how you can get involved.
In the nonprofit space, we tend to think about things like feelings and relationship, movements and revolutions, and this glamorous view of how we're changing the world. And all of that can be great, but how do we actually know what's going on? If we can't measure, we can't manage. And the truth of it is, we need data. And that's exactly what Nonprofit Finance Fund, or NFF, does. They collect information from thousands of nonprofits so they can share experience and expertise with cutting-edge data and analysis so we can feel equipped to make decisions about the future. Simply put, Nonprofit Finance Fund does lending, consulting, research, and advocacy for nonprofits. Today we have Jenn Talansky from Nonprofit Finance Fund joining us. She is going to talk to us about the 2022 State of the Nonprofit Sector Survey, which collected data, stories, and advice from over 1,000 nonprofit leaders across the nation about the impact of the last 2 years, from the pandemic to the events that activated calls for racial justice. We're going to talk about the imbalance between BIPOC-led and white-led organizations, which is really a continuation of the long-standing inequalities in nonprofit funding. And also this survey that Jen's going to tell us about, it lifts up the voices of nonprofit leaders, and it's going to be able to recommend changes that you can make either as a nonprofit or changes that you can share with your funders as well, so we can begin practicing things like trust-based philanthropy and eliminating inequitable funding practices. So thank you so much, Jenn, for joining us today. Thanks so much for joining us. I saw that you also like doing Taekwondo. Is that true?
Oh, yeah. I do. Look me up. Yeah, I've been doing Taekwondo for 19 years, and I love it.
19 years?
Oh, yeah.
You must be so
19
good.
19 years. I'm okay. I'm okay. I am in I do a little bit of teaching of it, so, and then I'm always a student.
Wow.
I love it. It's a great outlet. It works your mind while it's also working your body. It's worked on my balance.
Yes.
It's worked on my strength, holistically. Like, it's
so cool.
Yeah, it's fun. Yeah. And I do it with nice people.
You get belts in Taekwondo?
Yeah.
Like you'd imagine.
Yes,
and have you fulfilled the highest belt, or how does it work?
I believe there are 9 degrees of black belt. It depends. And the reason I'm saying I believe is because different schools have different philosophies, or different Taekwondo federations have different philosophy on that. But, 9 degrees of black belt. And so I am at 3rd degree of black belt and will probably remain there for my life, but we'll consider that a victory.
That is a victory. Wow. That's so cool. I love that. Well, don't mess with you. Yeah.
It's fun. Hey, I was able to, a stand-up paddleboard.
Yeah.
I got on a stand-up paddleboard, and I was able to get up and comfortably, keep my balance the first time I tried it, which I credit to Taekwondo.
Right. Oh, I'm sure there's so many things, like not losing your mind in the subway, like just all of the things that like able to keep you centered. Yes. That's awesome.
That's right.
Well, do you have your BA in English literature from Duke?
I do.
And then you also have a master's degree.
Yes, in social psychology from the London School of Economics.
That's awesome. And so what made you want to go into those things to begin with?
Yeah, on the English lit side, that was a no-brainer. I've always been a huge reader and writer. And with the social psychology degree, folks always said in an ideal world, you should make your vocation out of your avocation. And I always really liked studying people and what makes the world tick and how people think. And it was a really wonderful degree. And it's actually one that is very helpful in what I do, which is marketing, thought leadership. Marketing is very much about how do people think. And this survey that we're talking about today is a research aspect of our marketing and thought leadership work at Nonprofit Finance Fund.
I love that. And so did you get right into nonprofit finance fund, or was there more to your journey that led you to where you are now?
I have always been in marketing, but I did marketing in the for-profit world for a while. I came out of college with this degree in English Lit at a time when the career files for English Lit majors were really dusty at the career center, but there were a lot of opportunities in finance and consulting. And so I went into marketing, but in the finance world.
Mm-hmm.
And I did it a couple places. And I really said, I want to put this marketing muscle to work for something that I really feel good about contributing to and that's making a difference in the world. And so Nonprofit Finance Fund, NFF, is kind of a great combination of those things because we're a nonprofit. I'm using my marketing and communications and writing skills and doing it for the benefit of nonprofits. So NFF, Nonprofit Finance Fund, we work to improve the way money flows in the nonprofit sector. We want it to flow in ways that are more equitable, particularly ways that are more racially equitable. And we also want the funding to flow in ways that is just more helpful for nonprofit leaders who are trying to use their money to make really good decisions about how to advance their mission. And the way money works in the nonprofit sector is very different than how it works in the private world. Mm-hmm. The rules are contrarian and confusing. And so one of the things that's interesting, right, is that, if I were to go into a restaurant and order something, mm-hmm. I am the person paying and receiving the service. So I go in and I look at the menu and I say, I would like this guacamole and chips, and it costs X. That's what it says on the menu. And I'm going to make a decision about whether the guacamole and chips has that value for me. If it does, I will order it and I will pay for it. In the nonprofit sector, particularly in the social services space, the person paying and the person receiving and valuing the services are different, right? And this isn't about guacamole and chips, right? Like this is about serious, vital services. And so what you have is you might have whoever's paying for it is a government or is a foundation. Mm-hmm. And they are saying, okay, we want you to provide this food pantry or these educational services or this workforce development services, workforce training, and we're going to pay you X. And the nonprofit might say, well, that's great, but for me to deliver these services, the full cost is really X plus 20. And the funder says, well, that's nice, but that's not what I think it's worth. I think it's worth X. And so then the nonprofit who is deeply steeped in mission work and wants to provide those services has to say, am I going to accept the X and figure out with sweat equity or filling in holes from other people where to get that extra $20 or 20 times whatever the multiple is. So, and money's restricted too, right? So a funder might say, okay, you are running a fabulous food pantry and we really are supportive of you. And so we're going to pay for all your fresh fruit and vegetables. Well, that's great, but who's paying for the rent?
Yeah.
Who's for the facility? Who's paying for the IT, the tech system? Who's paying for the development director's salary? Who's paying for those things? And so the restrictions that are often on funding in the nonprofit sector also make it really difficult for nonprofit leaders. And the power imbalance that happens is it's problematic. And it's something that we want to see change. And the survey that we did is really, we hope, a tool towards helping address that. We are advocating directly to the people who have the money, who give the money in the nonprofit world to, hey, here's what nonprofit leaders are saying. This is what they need. Please change your practices. Yeah. But we also hope that this will be a tool for nonprofits themselves to say, hey, this is what's going on for all of us. It's not just me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so well said too. And I think my personal experience, I lived in Haiti post-earthquake for almost a decade. Wow. Mm-hmm. And Haiti is kind of the unfortunate cover model of funding being very complicated, maybe not getting to exactly where it needed to go, maybe not showing up at all, maybe getting, stuck in the books. But even on a smaller scale, people run into this a lot. And, even former colleagues of mine or people who are in this environment as well. But even to the extent of like, you are a nonprofit in Haiti, say you have, 100 kids in a feeding program post-earthquake, but you need money, right, to feed these kids. And so you're going to your donors and you're saying, which are like at that point, your friends, your family, maybe your church, something like that. And you're saying like, hey, these kids, they all lost their homes, they need to get fed. And the donor might say, that's great, but are you also evangelizing, or are you also giving them school books, or are also doing this? And so You're exactly right. Like even on a smaller scale, it becomes complicated because it becomes more, I guess, about pleasing the donor so that you can get any funds at all to even feed the kids something.
That's right.
And It can, after years of that happening, it gets misconstrued, it gets messy and gets muddy. And you end up being like, okay, are we even doing what our mission was to begin with in the first place?
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. And so we would really like to see more of the decision-making about what's needed being done by the people who are on the ground doing the direct work. And that's a disconnect that happens a lot. And, NFF, my organization, has been around for 40 plus years. And we've been saying a lot of the same things for a long time. We need to give more unrestricted funding. If you trust a nonprofit and like its programs and think it's doing good work, let its leaders, let them make the decision about how to spend the money. What was interesting, what we saw in the survey results, because this is the 9th time we've done this survey. And so the last time we did it was in 2018. But we started doing it in the Great Recession, 2009. And, every year we did the survey and we saw nonprofits in really bad shape financially. And this year, on a relative basis, and I emphasize relative because in the nonprofit sector, it's not that anybody's flush, but on a relative basis, we saw greater financial strength in this moment. And, the reason seems to be because during the pandemic, there were PPP loans, some of which were forgiven. Foundations gave more than the 5%, that they're mandated to give. Individual donors were generous. Like people really stepped up, and they got rid of restrictions. So they said, this is disaster funding time. Like you need to spend the money how you need to spend it. And so there was really just greater flexibility in general, letting go of some of the intensive reporting requirements that take a lot of time for nonprofits away from actually delivering on mission. And so this was a moment of relative strength and a relative easing of some of the crazy money rules, the restrictions that nonprofits so often deal with. And what it allowed is, so for instance, one of the folks who took our survey, they are an organization that supports new mothers and infant development. And when COVID happened and everything shut down, they took one of their funders released restrictions on money. And so they had always done home visits, and then during COVID, they couldn't. And so they took some of that money, that was where the restrictions were released, and they used it to buy sturdy strollers for the moms. And then they did their visits as outdoor walking visits between their staff and the moms. And so it was such a win, right? Like everybody got some exercise. They got to continue their programming, and they said, we would love to make this a permanent way that we operate. They couldn't have done that without the releasing of the restrictions, because that allowed them to buy strollers, because nobody probably said, early 2019, you're going to need to do outdoor walking.
Right.
So no, it wouldn't have occurred to anybody that strollers what was needed. So what we got in this moment of relative strength for nonprofits was a proof statement of what we've been asking for 40 plus years, right? We said on a pretty grand scale, right? There was more money, there were fewer restrictions, there were fewer reporting requirements, and nonprofits, the folks on the ground, got to make decisions that were responsive to community needs, and it worked. So now what we're hoping is that we see that continue, that we don't see, the funders, the folks who control the purse strings, reverting back to saying, all the decisions have to rest with me on how that money is spent. Keep it with the people who are close to the work, who are on the ground, embedded in communities.
That's so good. Aisha Benson, So
Yeah.
I heard her say that the pandemic unearthed the vulnerabilities that community-centered nonprofits are facing, and that these are also the same
Yep.
people that the world was relying on to be the first responders
Yep.
when the pandemic hit. So what an interesting
Yep.
dynamic that was.
It really was, and one of the things we saw in the survey was just how service demand went up for nonprofits,
Mhm.
particularly for BIPOC-led, community-centered nonprofits.
Yeah.
Went up even more than for white-led organizations. These are services that were really in demand. People needed them. And at the same time, a lot of the frontline workers were dealing with their own challenges, whether it was, COVID sickness in their families, dealing with childcare issues because of, as we all know, all of us who have kids, childcare became a real challenge, during COVID. And so what you really had sometimes was you had people who were being helpers were also the people that were impacted directly by COVID in some form. And the heart, the passion, the dedication, the sweat equity that the nonprofit labor force put out during the COVID pandemic. I mean, they always put out all those things, but it really went to another level. We saw there's one organization that is a medical lodging organization, and some of their staff lived at the facility.
Wow.
Like, moved into the facility during the pandemic because that was the only way they could really keep continuing services while keeping their, family safe at home. So, so it's a challenging time.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like two things are kind of happening. One is what I hear you saying is like that nonprofits who already do messy work had the ability to be innovative in what they were doing and take on a new approach. So there's some positives that happened through the pandemic.
Yeah.
But what I also hear you saying and have seen through your research is that it also brought to the surface some of the inequalities that have been happening for a long time within funding. So talk to us about your findings in that.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we saw inequities connected to the racial identity of the organization's leader. So what we did was we really wanted to look at the experiences of BIPOC-led organizations as compared to white-led organizations. And what we saw really tremendous service and connectivity on the part of the BIPOC-led organizations, right? We saw service demand go up for everybody. It went up a lot more for BIPOC-led organizations. 57% of BIPOC-led organizations, their leaders have lived experience that's relevant to one or more of the communities they serve, as compared to 18% of white-led organizations. BIPOC-led organizations have been, in general, working longer on advancing racial equity and advocating publicly for racial equity. So all that shows a tremendous positive contributions and connectivity of these organizations to what communities want. And so it was really unfortunate to see funding disparities persisting, right? And so there's been tremendous calls for racial equity. We've had a racial reckoning that's really gone on in this country over the last 2 years. And despite all of that, we still see inequities in the funding. And so, for instance, I talked before about unrestricted funding, which is, that's the gold standard, right? It lets you as a nonprofit leader decide how you want to spend the money best in service of your mission. And it's very hard to get. I mean, most organizations don't get much of it. We were really surprised to see overall, we were shocked actually overall to see that 36% of organizations who took this survey this year got half or more of their funding in the prior year as unrestricted funding. That was shocking to us. But when we broke that down, we saw that it was 41% of white-led organizations got half or more of their money as unrestricted, as compared to 26% of BIPOC-led organizations. Yeah. We also saw differences in the percentage of BIPOC-led versus white-led organizations that received corporate donations, money from the federal government, excluding PPP, and investment income. It was unfortunate to really see disparities that indicate the frankly systemic racism that we're still dealing with in nonprofit funding, as in so many other of our systems and institutions.
Yeah, you're right. And it's not acceptable in any of the sectors. It feels especially ironic, I don't know if we can use that word, but in a sector that is meant for social justice.
Yes, it feels devastating in a sector that is meant for social justice to see that. But, in terms of, you and I talked earlier about the value of data, right? And so having this data to show this, we hope that this can be something that can really spark, and be one of the many things. There are many people working for greater equity. We want this to be a tool that folks can use to say, this is not okay. We have to address this. There's probably folks who anecdotally think it's fine, we're doing well. But when you see this data, you say, no, we're not where we need to be. So,
yeah, and you're right. And I think that's why this data is especially important.
One of the ways that we can work towards the inequities on the funding side for BIPOC-led organizations is really, for anybody who's funding, go beyond your traditional networks. Don't just go with word of mouth and who you know. Really put yourself out there, get out into the community, do the research, push to find new organizations, because some of the more grassroots, potentially newer, smaller organizations that may be BIPOC-led, they may not be on your radar screen unless you go that extra mile. And that, I feel like that's an easy to do, right? Like that doesn't require rehauling your whole foundation. The other thing that I would say that's also in the category, I think, of easy to do is provide counsel, open up your network, right? So if you are a funder, seek out nonprofits that are maybe smaller, BIPOC-led, or newer, and be like, hey, these are some of the things that, this is how to think about writing your grant proposals. Let me introduce you to other folks. Maybe I can fund you. Maybe I can't because you're not in my issue area. But, Joe can. Let me introduce you to Joe. Like, these are things that people can do individually that start to open up, different pathways for organizations that may not have been included in traditional funding networks. There are bigger things as well, but those are some things that I feel like, because one of the things that happens sometimes is folks say, well, what can I do? I'm just one person. Well, those are easy things.
Yeah, very tangible steps.
And another easy thing that you can do is don't be coy about whether you're funding someone or not. Be straightforward. People have limited time to chase lots of funding, so don't leave people in the dark about whether you're going to fund them or not. Don't let them put in tons and tons of time and then disappear. No ghosting. So, be upfront, pretty early on, like, we're going to be able to make this happen, and let's work together on kind of shaping it in the way that we need to. And then I would also just encourage nonprofits, and I know this is hard, but be frank, like be direct, say what you need, because honestly, getting a grant that covers half of the cost of delivering what you need is ultimately going to create problems for your organization and therefore for the people you serve. So do you really even want that grant? So say what you need. Maybe you'll get it, maybe you won't. And then you can make a decision about whether you want to accept it. But if you don't ask and what you get offered is half, I don't know if you're any worse off than asking and getting refused, but you might get it if you ask.
Yeah.
So,
no, that's good. We'll take that New Yorker advice. That just say it like it is. New York.
Yeah. Hey, you guys, and then get some pizza. No, okay. Yeah. I'm going to stop while I'm not ahead here. Okay.
No, that's good. No, it's true. Somebody said it well, of like, everybody's adults. Like, we're adults. We don't have to, like, your funders are adults, like nonprofits are adults. Like, you don't have to dance around. The ultimate goal is to help the people that we're trying to serve. And so let's cut out some of this fuzziness here and just get right to the point.
Yeah, that's right. Let's use everybody's time well. Exactly.
Yeah. That's good. That's well said. So if people who are either running or working in nonprofits are listening, what's something that's helpful to them? How do they get a hold of this data? How do they use this data? What does that look like?
Yeah. So to get hold of the data, let me start with that. To get hold of the data, very easy. We go to our website, which is nff.org. There's a link on the homepage, or if you can remember this, it's nff.org/survey. And there's all the data. It's available for free. This is something we do as a public service. And we also want to honor the contributions of the 1,168 nonprofit leaders who took the time to do this and really put, their collective voices out there. So that is where you can get it. And there's resources of all kinds. There's a shorter brochure, there's full results, there are 2-minute videos. So kind of however you want to consume the information, it's there. In terms of what you can do with this information, if you're a nonprofit, it does a few things. I think one, for folks who are saying, I'm facing all of these challenges and this is incredibly hard. Am I alone?
Yes,
is it me?
right?
No, it's not you. And so what this data really can do is contextualize for you,
So good.
how you're doing and, how your peers are doing, and just you're not alone. But the other thing it is it's a tool for advocacy, right? So there's a power imbalance in the conversations that happen between those who control the funding and those who use the funding for social good. And we really want to see that get evened out. And so what this data can do is serve as a way for you to advocate for your needs, to say, look, this is what it looks like and how we can deliver services when we're given unrestricted funding. These are the kinds of changes we can make. 66% of organizations are concerned that they don't get their full costs covered. 73% are really worried and say that long-term sustainability is a top financial challenge. That's a challenge for me too. And if you support my programs, what can we do about this together? So we see this as a conversation opener that can really be less about, it's just me and my challenges, and more of a, let me contextualize for you what's going on in this sector, and let's use that to have a conversation about what my needs are. One of the challenges we saw was over half the organizations identified having enough staff to do the work is a problem, and competitive pay, being able to pay competitively. And so that's something, being able to point to that and say, listen, we're competing with for-profit entities for talent, and we have specific skills that we need, and you're not paying us enough for us to in turn pay our people competitively. And so if you care about these services, you got to pay us a little more so that we can turn around and pay our people. These are some of the kinds of conversations we hope that the data can spark.
Yes, that's so great. And I think something that was touched on in your research as well was output versus outcome, and kind of how when you have unrestricted funds, or through the pandemic, or through the changing of kind of the world over the last few years, the way that nonprofits have to measure how their work is quote unquote successful is changing as well. One of the examples that was used was, for example, like a homeless shelter. Like, are they being held to the measurement of being a hotel? So how many beds do they have? How often is each bed full? Or are they being incentivized to end homelessness?
Right. And that goes back to the whole thing about unrestricted funding, right? And so if that person who runs a shelter for folks experiencing homelessness can only spend money on beds and meals, and can't spend money on job training or a social worker or mental health services, you're basically paying them to be in the hoteling business, and you are not paying them to really try and end homelessness for the folks that are coming into their sphere. So yeah, it's tricky, but the measuring of outcomes also challenge include issues because, one, funders don't always pay. They want to see measurement, but don't always pay for it. And you then run into the folks who are the institutions that are well resourced financially are the ones that have the capacity to really do measurement. So that kind of also opens another tricky equity door.
Yeah, no, that's well said. And I appreciate you touching on the ideas of like overhead and even the amount of administrative work it goes into seek funding, until you've worked in the nonprofit world, it's difficult to understand, why those things might exist. But you're right, there needs to be a standard of talent, just like there is in every other type of workforce, if not more in some cases because you're literally dealing with people's lives, and it's important that that's taken seriously.
Yeah. And, we always talk about that nonprofit is a tax status. It's not that,
Yes. So good.
So, I mean, can you imagine trying to run any sort of institution, any sort of business without HR, without, well, now I guess we can imagine running a someplace without a physical office.
Right. Yeah.
Right. But without IT equipment, right? Without paying for Zoom for a whole company, you couldn't do it. And it's the same for a nonprofit because, listen, unless everybody who works in the nonprofit sector is independently wealthy, which I can assure you they are not, they have to go home and feed their families. And one of the other challenges that we see a lot is because of how nonprofits are funded and how much they're funded, they can't always pay their frontline workers a living wage.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a problem.
Yeah.
That's a problem. Huge one.
Yeah, it is definitely a problem. And you see a lot of burnout in the nonprofit world anyway, even if people are paid at the same level as somebody who's in the for-profit world. Again, just because it is messy work, it's hard work. And if there's extra stressors such as financial burden, that can lead to higher turnover. And if there's higher turnover, it's more difficult to stay relevant in the community you're working with because developing relationships. So absolutely, this information is very important. So we covered a lot of different areas. Is there anything else specifically that you wanted to touch on that came out in the survey that you think is important for the audience to hear?
There's probably a million things, but I would say one of the things that I think is important is that I really do want to actually applaud the funders and the government for how they largely funded during COVID. It wasn't that it was perfect, but people were generous. There was a speed and nimbleness that we don't always see. And I just want to encourage anybody listening, please don't go back to the old ways of the broken system. This worked. This was a massive proof statement for the benefit of doing things this way, for letting organizations do things like convert their dollars to buying sturdy carriages for moms in a program. So I would say that's one important point that I want to make. And just that nonprofit workers, nonprofits in general, are part of essential services. They were on the front lines. They were relied upon by government, by communities during COVID. And we have to honor that and recognize that, the people doing that are people who have to go home and pay their rent and, feed their children and deal with childcare. And we have to treat nonprofit as a tax status, not that they don't need any money to do the work that they do.
Yes. I think nonprofit, one of your colleagues said, is bad branding. And I think that's true. We need to rebrand. Both of us work in marketing. So we'll hold it our mission to begin to rebrand. It's a terrible name because it's not profit.
It is.
So, yeah.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. And just end us with a quick reminder of why data is important. And again, what we can do with that, both from the funder and the nonprofit side.
Sure. So we did the State of the Nonprofit Sector Survey to provide data for nonprofits, for funders, for anybody who cares about the work of the nonprofit sector and wants it to be able to deliver its work. A lot of this information was about the financial status of nonprofits and how finance connects to program delivery. And, the picture it paints isn't always pretty. And we really wanted to eliminate that truth. We want to celebrate the wins. We want to bring to light the things that are not wins, and we must address them. And we want to give everybody a starting point for a data-based conversation that isn't personal. It's not just about you. It's not just about your organization. This is the larger system that folks are operating in. It's really messed up. The data is showing you that. And so let's have a conversation about making change.
I love that. Well, we appreciate all the work you guys are doing. We know that data isn't always sexy, but We love that it's there. We love that it's free and accessible to us. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said, if anything, it just helps you feel like you're not alone, that you're not the only one having some of these struggles while you're doing this really difficult work as well. Yeah. So appreciate all the work you and your team are doing.
It is rather ironic that an English lit major has become a total data geek. But let me just say one final thought. You know, I talked about this as a moment of relative financial strength for the nonprofit sector, and that it's a moment, and that there's still tremendous worry about long-term financial sustainability, paying full cost, etc. And just to contextualize, what do I mean by it's a moment of relative financial strength? 3 in 10 of the organizations in our survey have enough money to pay for more than 6 months of expenses. Okay. And that was oh my God, that's so good. So if you think about that, what that means is that if 7 out of 10 organizations were to keep their same expenses, but the revenue dropped out, they would go out of business in less than 6 months. Some of them would go out of business in 1 to 2 months.
Wow.
So only 3 in 10 would survive if the revenue dropped out and they maintain their expenses for more than 6 months. Wow. And I am calling that relative financial strength, because for the nonprofit sector, it is. But is that how we really, is that the state we want, the social safety net that we rely on to be in?
Yeah, so good. Yeah.
So,
I mean, imagine if we put that in the context of the for-profit world.
Exactly.
70, just looking around, right now, I'm looking at all the businesses, 70% in 6 months. What?
Or less. I mean, and you think about it, how long did revenue drop out for many businesses during COVID?
Yeah.
More than 6 months. More than 6 months.
And that felt like Armageddon. I can't even imagine.
It did.
Yeah.
It did. What if all those nonprofits shut down? I mean, what if we've seen, and we don't want this, we don't want to encourage this. We had a nonprofit client of ours once who took out a personal mortgage on their home to keep the nonprofit running. Should that be how things work?
Right.
Especially because government, by the way, is providing a lot of this funding. Right. So is that what we want our government, how we want our government to be paying for vital services? I don't think so.
Wow. Yeah, it's definitely eye-opening, but I appreciate some of the encouragement in there as well of the last few years were really crazy, but nonprofits continued to step up and really lead the way.
They did. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and a special thank you to Jenn and the Nonprofit Finance Fund for taking the time to do that very insightful survey. You can find that information at nff.org/survey. You can also find all these links and Jenn's information, as well as Nonprofit Finance Fund links at lapointe.life. Also, feel free to email me directly. I would love to hear any feedback you have about this or other podcasts we have done. Callie@lapointefoundation.org. Until next time, keep on fighting for justice.